A 29-year-old engineer.
Oh, this is gonna fail hard.
And his team designed a submarine that can produce 16-foot thick, 82-foot wide hexagonal icebergs.
And at that, it's dead already. But because this was featured on CNN and Forbes, I feel like a little bit of overkill.
The submarine would form the iceberg by filling its central cavity with seawater and filtering out the salt to boost the freezing point of the water by more than 3 degrees Fahrenheit.
And I guarantee you that by the end of this video, you'll be thinking, yeah, that's just really dumb.
While shielding the chamber with a hatch to protect it from the sun. And a month later, it ejects the iceberg.
Yeah, I'm not quite so sure these engineers understand how ice works.
The submarines will be large enough to contain social and research facilities. The hexagonal-shaped icebergs, or ice babies according to Koda Hatuhaha,
Yeah, ice babies,
can be connected and form gigantic ice caps, according to the team responsible for the project.
So we come to the guts of it on CNN. Scientists and designers are proposing radical ways to refreeze the Arctic. And wow, just look how it's making all those little ice babies in some really, really badly photoshopped pictures. Anyway, so down to the guts of it. The idea recently named runner-up in an international design competition appealing for radical approaches to sustainability. We'll come to why that's stupid. Latest was a series of proposals for refreezing the Earth's poles. Led by a 29-year-old architect, the group envisages a submersible vessel capable of producing 16-foot thick, 82-foot wide hexagonal icebergs. So the proportions are basically 1:4, 1:5, that sort of thing, between thickness and width. So roughly 1:4 thickness to width. It's kind of like these icebergs are floating entirely out of the water. Not sure that's how physics works. Look, we're not talking complicated rocket science here. We have expressions like this in common parlance, like tip of the iceberg, to tell you that most of the iceberg is under the water. So basically, this means that either the CNN reporter didn't know that the majority of the iceberg is under the water, or didn't bother to actually check the dimensions of the iceberg in their reporting with the actual picture in their reporting. Forbes goes one step further and actually gives us the schematic of this amazing ship where the ice is frozen almost entirely out of the water. And because it's a little hard to read, I did actually track down the original where, yes, that does actually say freezing fresh air into iceberg. Andrew Shepherd, a professor of Earth observation at UK's Leeds University, described the idea as an interesting engineering solution, rather than a really dumb idea that doesn't understand the basics of how ice floats in water. Because it turns out when you look at their winning entry into this design competition, yes, ice floats like styrofoam.
A 29-year-old engineer.
And yes, that is the submarine there. And this is the problem. But the bizarre thing is when defining the problem, all of a sudden, ice floats like regular ice.
And his team designed a submarine that can produce 16-foot thick.
Yeah. Back to our professor of Earth observation on CNN. Though he questioned the project's scalability and estimated that replacing the polar ice at the same rate it's disappearing at the last 4 decades would require about 10 million submarines. I'm sure that's true, but we don't quite have to go to professors of Earth observation to debunk this. I think we can do this in the kitchen with a little bit of ice.
So, this is the main problem that you run into, is you get your ice and you stick it in the water and it overwhelmingly floats under the surface. So if we actually move over to a block of ice that is more the geometry that they have in their proposal. Oh, crack, crack, crack. what you'll find is getting it to float the right way up is actually kind of tricky. So it just doesn't want to work, no matter which way you go. And as you can see, I mean, for it to float as far out of the water as they have in their promo stuff, these are about right for the dimensions. It just does not want to float the way they have it in their promotional material.
Well, to be fair, it didn't actually win the design award, but in a remarkable tribute to how brilliant this idea is, it actually won second and third place, which was apparently still enough to be featured on CNN, Deezen, Vice, Forbes, Science Alert, and Business Insider, all of which are happy to report the dimensions of the ice blocks without actually mentioning the fact that the ice magically in this proposal floats like styrofoam, which is probably fairly in line with the actual brief of the competition. The ASA International Design Competition this year is dedicated to fresh ideas in sustainability, approaches so radical, unanticipated and transformative that they earn the epithet of uncanny. Well, ice that floats like this certainly is uncanny. Okay, so it's dead.
The double tap. In those moments when you're not sure the undead are really dead, don't get all stingy with your bullets.
So how about some overkill? Now the Arctic, like every other place on Earth, spends half of its year in darkness. The difference, of course, being that the way it does that is somewhat different in that it basically gets 6 months of continuous sunlight and then 6 months of continuous darkness. And it's always at the edge of the world. So the Earth, of course, is a spinning ball, but if we look at the Earth from this perspective, with the sun directly behind us, and imagine the Earth as a flat two-dimensional disk, every part of that disk is going to get exactly the same amount of energy from the sun. Difference is, of course, if we stop the Earth, say, here, so all of the Antarctic here gets about the same amount of energy as the same area at the equator. Difference, of course, is that, that area is about half that of Australia, but it's shared over a landmass at least twice that of Australia. That means that the Antarctic is getting about 1/4 of the energy density that you get at the equator during summertime. And then, of course, in wintertime, it gets nothing at all. So solar panels in winter at the Arctic, not such a great idea. But that also means that you get 6 continuous months of light as well, right? I wonder what cloud cover's like over the Arctic Ocean in summertime. Frequently, cloud cover exceeds 80% over much of the Arctic Ocean in July. Yeah, reducing the amount of solar radiation that reaches the surface by reflecting much of it before it gets to the surface. That might be a problem. But let's not dwell on the minutiae. Let's think about our optimum solar panel setup here. Now, your optimum solar panel setup is going to be such that it maximizes the surface area pointing towards the sun, which is going to be at about 70 odd degrees like this. Laying the solar panels flat like this is just a way to ensure they generate about half of their power. But this looks more stylistic and cool, so I guess we're going to go with that. Then, of course, most people know that refrigerators don't just make cold, so to speak. They separate hot and cold stuff, but you've got to put work in to do that, basically running the compressor and all that sort of thing. So if you mix the hot air that comes out of your refrigerator with the cold air that you get from the inside, and add to that the heat from running the generator, on average, these will always end up generating more heat than they actually cool down. The bottom line is, this is a heat generating machine that they want to run in the Arctic. It's pumping more hot air out into the atmosphere than it's cooling in the ice. Now that's not necessarily a showstopper. in that if your goal here is to reflect heat by coating the surface of the sea with reflective ice rather than, sun-absorbing sea, then in principle, if you could do it at scale, maybe. But then you take a look at just the dimensions of this, and you realize this is a complete farce. And we're just going to take a look at the energy costs. I'm going to give them the ice making machine for free. So what sort of energy costs are we looking at to make an iceberg like this? Now, modern refrigerators work fairly close to the thermodynamic limit. There's not going to be any great improvements in their efficiency. And an industrial ice maker that'll make tons of ice per day will cost about 90 kilowatt hours to make a ton of ice. Even with the cheapest solar energy, because you've got to make the solar panels, that sort of thing, that costs about 10 cents per kilowatt hour. So the price of making the ice is basically the energy costs, which are about $10 per ton, or $10,000 per kiloton, $10 million per megaton, and $10 billion per gigaton. And if you want to go really hardcore, it's $10 trillion per teraton, trillion tons, which is curiously roughly how much ice is melting on Earth per year at the moment. Meaning that just the energy costs of refreezing the ice that we're losing at the moment is about $10 trillion. That's roughly half the US GDP, or 10% of the entire planet's GDP. Or our magical ice babies, which miraculously float on the water, which weigh some 2,000 tons, would cost about $20,000 a piece. Yeah, just for the energy costs. But don't you get some sort of benefit from it being really cold in the Arctic? Well, no. Remember this.
The submarine would form the iceberg by filling its central cavity with seawater and filtering out the salt to boost the freezing point of the water by more than 3 degrees Fahrenheit.
You'll be shocked to find out that the people who don't understand the density of ice and how it floats in water also don't understand the thermodynamics of ice and water. So let's take a 1 kilogram block of ice at freezing point at 0 degrees Celsius and start pumping energy into it. It takes some 300 odd kilojoules of energy merely to melt that kilo of ice, turning it from a solid into a liquid. And this is because phase changes are energetically expensive. And if you want to freeze it again, you've got to take that energy out. However, once you've got your liquid water at freezing point, heating it is relatively cheap. It only takes about 4 kilojoules to heat the 1 kilo of water up by 1 degree Celsius. So some 100 or so degrees later, and the vapor pressure of the water is now up to 1 atmosphere, boiling point at sea level. It only takes slightly more energy than melting the ice than it takes to heat the water from water at freezing point up to boiling point. And this is why ice is so good at keeping your drinks cool, because melting ice takes comparatively lots of energy compared to cooling water. But let's keep going with our water at boiling point, shall we? You want to turn the water at 100 degrees Celsius into steam at 100 degrees Celsius at 1 atmosphere. Now that's the big one. That's going to cost you some 2,000 kilojoules. And of course, the place we come across this all the time in our everyday life is that it takes a comparatively short amount of time for the kettle to get up from room temperature to boiling point compared to if you were to leave the kettle on for it to boil dry. Like I said, changing the states takes lots of energy compared to merely heating or cooling it. So cooling the water down from freezing point, that's 0 degrees Celsius, to the freezing point of seawater, which is minus 2 degrees Celsius, is operationally insignificant compared to the cost of actually freezing the water. But the bizarre thing is they actually want to desalinate the water such that it will freeze 2 degrees sooner?
The submarine would form the iceberg by filling its central cavity with seawater and filtering out the salt to boost the freezing point of the water by more than 3 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah. So here they want to desalinate the water to decrease its freezing point by about 1 degree Celsius. So to cool water by 1 degree Celsius takes about 4 kilojoules per kilogram. And then they're going to have to freeze it, which takes about 300 kilojoules per kilogram. Yeah, I'm not so sure that's worth the energetic costs of desalinating the water for, especially seeing as the mere act of freezing the sea ice excludes about half of the salt from it.
Oh, right.
Are we quite sure it's dead yet? Well, not quite.
Love you.
So I'm going to call these icebergs about 10 meters thick. 10 meters is roughly 5 people standing on top of each other, which is about right. Icebergs are 90% under the water, so 1 meter out of the water, 9 under it, that sort of thing. And we know the size of people because of pictures like this. Or the schematics of the ship here, which very usefully have people on for scale. So why 10 meters? Well, turns out if you were to liquefy the atmosphere, it's equal to roughly 10 meters of water. And the heat capacity of the air like that is about the same as water. You know, ignoring little things like a factor of 4 in scale. Because fundamentally, what the heat capacity is basically the energy it takes to make the molecules go faster, to get hotter.
Cookie!
And seeing as air molecules and water molecules weigh about the same, so a fixed amount of energy will heat up about 10 meters of water, or the entire atmosphere above it, by about the same amount. And you'll recall from earlier that refrigerators don't actually create cold, they separate hot from cold. And you will recall that to actually freeze water took about the same amount of energy as heating water up from freezing point to about 70 degrees Celsius, 3/4 of the way to boiling. Practical upshot is freezing 10 meters of ice would heat all of the atmosphere above it to about 70 degrees Celsius. And that's on the very generous assumption that the heat capacity of the water and the atmosphere per kilo are about the same, and it turns out it's significantly easier to heat the atmosphere. The practical upshot is to freeze 10 meters of water releases about enough energy to heat the atmosphere above it to the point where you could bake cookies in the open air at the North Pole.
Cookie! 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 Me love cookie!
And that's today's video. If you enjoyed it, why not drop a thumbs up on it? Subscribing is always a good idea if you don't want to miss out on more videos like this. And if you really like the work of this channel and want to support it directly, you can do so on Patreon. And as ever, thanks for watching.